Welcome to the Liberating Yoga podcast, a space to explore yoga as a practice and a path of healing, resistance, and deep connection. My name is Harpinder Mann. I'm a yoga educator, a writer, a seeker, here to dive into the roots of yoga, dismantle appropriation, and uplift practices that honor collective liberation while making yoga accessible. All of these conversations were recorded 2 years ago as a part of my research and interviews for my upcoming book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. Now I'm bringing them all to you, unedited and in full, to continue the dialogue on how we can honor yoga's past while shaping its future. In this episode, I sit down with one of my friends, a yoga teacher, a social justice advocate, Susanna Barkataki, about the history of modern yoga, accountability for teachers, and decolonization in practice. Today's yoga culture is shaped by capitalism, exclusivity, and appropriation. But how did we get here, and how can we preserve yoga's wholeness for future generations? Let's get into it. So we'll jump right into it. And the first question I've been asking all the excellent people I've been interviewing, and Susanna, you are one of those people, is what does yoga mean to you?
To me, yoga is a liberation practice. It's a practice of personal and collective liberation. And that's connected to it being like this whole complex system, of which there are many paths. There wasn't just one path to liberation. There were so many different paths. But overall, the codification of yoga is like how to get free. How can I get free within myself from anger, from suffering, from a sense of a separated self, and free. I often also think about like free from and free for, right? So free from those separations, but free for interconnection, for community, for collective uplift. And yoga is all of that.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, because I also often like to think about yoga as being a liberation practice, and it's not just for me, it's also for those around me and for my community. Something I was writing about today is the spiritual bypassing that can happen, where I oftentimes find in spiritual bypassing, it's a focus on just like me, myself, I'm doing fine, so no one else matters. And what I love about what you're sharing is it's that interconnectedness that's so important. How does that interconnectedness show up for you in your practice and in your life?
I mean, honestly, for me, like I felt so disconnected, like so separated from myself and from my community and from my family. And that it's like now the yoga that I practice, it both is a vehicle for what helped me feel reconnected, but also the way that I consistently create the conditions for reconnection, if that makes sense. So I'll just give like a specific example because that sounds very abstract, but like in terms of separation from my body, right? Like if I'm feeling stress or tension or pain somewhere in my body, it's like I can bypass it, and keep working or keep pushing on or whatever. Or I can slow down and pay attention and then connect. And then what yoga asana particularly allows me to do is care for and tend, like the aching neck or the hurting back or, whatever it might be. And so it really is the interconnection comes in slowing down and showing up to my practice. But because of having a consistent practice, like daily, more or less asana, of course, there's some days that the asana doesn't happen, but also it's like everything in my life I look at through the lens of yogic philosophy, say, or yoga practice. So in being with my kiddo, or, solving a problem, like if, for example, another one, like an email doesn't go out, right? And it's like someone on my team didn't send that email, or something malfunctioned and someone else is responsible for that. I can show up to that situation with a sense of anger, frustration, blame. But the problem is just the problem, right? And they're a person trying to do their job and like has other concerns in life. And so if I show up to that situation from a yogic perspective of like, we're connected here, we're all working to the same end of, things flowing, then it's like, well, this happened. How do we solve it? Not, creating more disruption. And those are very like kind of everyday examples, but that for me is the interconnection, is like moment to moment to moment.
I love that everyday example, because I feel so often in this modern yoga or postural yoga space where it's just like I go on my mat for 60 minutes, I do my practice, and now my yoga is complete. And what I love in this everyday example is it's moving from that me to we. It's also moving in a way where we're causing less harm. We're causing less harm to ourselves, to those around us, and finding a way to be with ourselves in a more compassionate way. And when I think about yoga, I think about it's really that increasing that like self-knowledge, and also knowing like what bothers us, what triggers us, and being able to minimize those things and respond in a more gentle, compassionate, and just aware, in a more awareful way as well.
Yeah, I think a lot about how like yoga is not something you attend. It's a way of life, right? Or something you live. And it doesn't just happen at the studio or when we put a class on YouTube or something. It can continue through everything. But in the West, that understanding of what yoga is has been boxed up into little things like studio packages or clothing or apparel, things that can be bought and sold and exchanged. And it really isn't what yoga is.
That leads me into the next question that I had is like, what's normalized in modern yoga or postural yoga that causes harm?
I mean, so many things. So many things. I feel like it's interlocking systems that are normalized, that normalize oppressions. And I would say it's Western yoga. And I also think it's more and more happening in India as well, in terms of like ethno-nationalism and caste oppression. Like it's not that yoga itself is immune to these systems. And so I'll talk about the West. We can talk about, India as well. But I would say there's other folks who are probably more expert in that than I am, because I've grown up in the West. And the very first yoga class, quote unquote, that I went to, it was like all the norms, thin, able-bodied, telling students what to do with their body without giving them agency or choice, pushing folks into poses, physical adjustments without consent, like on and on and on, saying things like, one day you'll be able to get your leg behind your head, or, keep going, tough it up, tough it out. There's so much that's normalized. And those things that I'm sharing, maybe you've heard them or other folks have heard them. It's like those over time create a context that becomes the culture of a practice or an institution like yoga. And those are not actually connected to what yoga is or what its kind of basic tenets and philosophies are. So I would, if we were to kind of name it or label it, I would definitely say patriarchy, gender normativity, like gender norms, and white supremacy, like centering of what is considered to be a norm. And so these are the like heteronormativity too. I mean, we could keep ableism, right? We could keep going and name many of the things that show up in general kind of culture in the US or in Europe or wherever we are in the West today. It would be like those same norms show up in yoga spaces. But somehow, I don't know if you see this, Harpinder, I feel like they're amplified. Like if I just was to go to, I don't know, like a cooking class, I don't know that I would feel there was this amplification of these things. Maybe, but they really do seem, something about the context of yoga in the West is like, it's like we took all of these wonderful, like this wonderful process and practice that yoga is, and then said like, let's throw it into this mixture of colonialism and capitalism, and like became a monster, really. It's really hard. And I hear from a lot of people, I'm curious if you've had this too, like particularly my family or friends who are South Asian or other folks of color, or elders, like I don't belong in yoga. And these are South Asian folks, right? Like from whom yoga has come. And so when you hear people who a practice has come from say, I can't go to a yoga class, we know something has gone terribly wrong.
And that was the start of my experience, where I was an undergrad at UCLA. And I had spent all of my life thinking, okay, I go to college, I've made it. Like I have to get into a good school. That's like the beginning of my life. And I had a hard childhood and a lot of different things where it really felt like college is going to be the answer, the escape. I get to college and I'm like, I'm here now. I'm like, I still don't feel good. Like I still feel even more like lost and confused. And there's something in me that was just like, okay, yoga is supposed to help people feel better. It's supposed to provide answers. And I started going to studios in Westwood, and it was just all white folks, able-bodied, in matching workout sets, like looked all very perfect. And I just walk in, I'm like, what does this have to do with yoga? It's just like a coordinated dance routine everybody is doing that no one really wants to teach it to me. And I was like, I don't feel like I belong. I don't feel like I'm welcomed in. Like no one's like, hi, what's your name? And it wasn't until I went to India the next year or the year after working with a company, and I was going to the Ananda Sangha, and I felt that sense of like, oh, this is yoga. There's a sense of belonging. And I think that's something a lot of people experience, where you go into these spaces and it's just like, what does this have to do with yoga? And I think also just that like power hierarchy that's created, where the teacher's like at the front, they're commanding the power. No one else can really say anything. There's not really like, and something I intentionally started doing with my classes is letting everybody have a chance to speak. Like, how's everybody doing? How's your day? Maybe you talk in small groups. Maybe there's a question that's posed. And then we kind of move into that practice. But it is interesting, just interesting, but also just terrible, the way that this practice has been stripped of its like original goals and intents. And it's just really about how do we focus on our physical body and get ourselves to be perfectionists in every other part of our life, but also in this space as well. And I was like, this practice is never about perfection. It was never about comparison with one another. And I think there's a reason we're doing this work and we're having these conversations, because it bothers us.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry you had that experience. It just is like, right? But what's powerful to me, because I, similar to you, like had a hard childhood, didn't feel like I belonged, was very disconnected, and went to yoga. I was lucky in that I had one of those, like, you know how there can be like that wonderful YMCA teacher, or like the teacher that's just very unassuming. I don't even remember what identity they were, right? Like I just remember the feeling of being in their class, and their class was so permission giving and supportive. And I was in Balasana and child's pose on the earth, and just like tears started falling, because it's like, oh, I can find a way home. Like I can feel connected to myself. And part of it is through this practice. And so it is like, despite everything that the West and all of these isms do to it, the power of yoga persists, right? And we feel it and we can access it. And I think particularly for folks, it's from our heritage, right? It's from like we may feel, I do want to kind of acknowledge colonialism and how much it can disconnect us. So some folks may not feel a connection, but it is absolutely your right to choose to create it if you don't feel it, and cultivate it. But it's there, right? And it's very, very powerful.
A comment that I've come up across a couple times, and it's been interesting. This is really only I've heard it from white women, although I could see it being in the narrative for other folks as well, is, well, at least we're getting them to the mat and they're moving their bodies and they're like connecting to their bodies for the first time. Like, isn't that what matters? And I mean, I think that's a bypassing in that in itself, where you're not taking the time to understand why the person perhaps expressing their concerns is saying that. You're like, well, I'm just shutting it down. Isn't this fine? What would you have to say for folks that have that narrative in their mind?
Yeah. So much of my answer to that, it honestly does depend on context. And I'll say why, because I do think that there is a benefit to people opening up or getting in the door to practicing yoga, if it's through asana or even fitness, because they might go deeper. And I think every professional, any teacher who's utilizing yoga as part of what they're sharing, including fitness professionals, like I think of I used to love doing Zumba, and even before Zumba, it was like aerobics and kickboxing and stuff. And at the end of class, the last 10, 15 minutes, if the teacher was doing a cool down, which hopefully they were, was basically yoga, but they didn't say, we're going to do some yoga inspired stretching, or we're going to do some yoga, or we're going to, they just said, okay. And they would tell us what to do. But I think every person in that position of power should acknowledge, we're doing something inspired by yoga, or we're going to do yoga, a practice that comes from India. That's a full complex system. You can learn more by, whatever, like I'm going to teach you just some physical practices for this reason. But if you want to learn more, there's plenty of resources or something. So the person taking the class understands they're getting a small part of a much bigger thing. Kind of like, if, like, I'm just thinking of, like in medicine, for example, like we wouldn't go to, I don't know, like a neurologist for a broken bone. It's like, we need to be better at explaining the scope of our kind of practice and the limitations of what we're teaching, and then letting folks know that there's a whole other like branch of medicine, essentially, right? Because that's what it is. It's like a whole system of health and well-being and healing, and liberation. So that for me is important. So that's the first part. It's like, I think I would say, like, qualify what you're doing and then point people in another direction, because I think it's a both and. And then the other side is like, do you realize the harm that you're causing, right? By cutting off one, like it's cultural appropriation, you're undervaluing culture, its traditions, its rituals, its practices, by not bringing that in and by not addressing or pairing it with like hip hop in order to make it more popular and quote, get people on the mat. Like, okay, like you can say, I don't actually love the idea of pairing yoga with any kind of trendy or whatever popular thing. I don't think it needs it. I think it's enough as it is. But if you're going to do that, then at least say, like, I'm doing this and yoga is all these other things, but also acknowledge the harm, right? And address that. Yeah, I'm curious what you think on that one, because it's tough. It's almost like people get very possessive. They feel like we're trying to take yoga away from them. And we're not, at least I'm not necessarily trying to take it away from you. I'm just saying, like, acknowledge the harm, acknowledge the rest of the practice so people get access to that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. Because as you were talking, what was coming up for me is, as yoga teachers, we have responsibility. And I also think about what one of my teachers has shared is we can only take students as far as we have gone. So if we've gone into the shallow side of the pool, that's where we're taking our students. We're all standing on the shallow side, just hanging out. And oftentimes maybe like a student only needs to go into the shallow side, but you as a teacher, at least the hope is that you really continue your practice and you kind of gone into the depth of this pool and really understood like what more there is to yoga and to yourself. And I think when teachers say, well, at least they're connecting to their body, at least they're coming onto their mat, I think it's a teacher's responsibility to say, okay, yes, that's a huge benefit. I absolutely agree. And like you're saying, we're not trying to say, take away this practice. You can't practice asana anymore. Please, I can't stop people from practicing asana, nor do I want to stop them. But what we're saying is like also acknowledge that there's more, there's more here. There's more to the depth of practice. But I do find that people, some aren't even willing to listen, aren't wanting to understand, and have their blocks up, their blinders on, and that does infuriate me. I've had to come back to my own places of equanimity around these things, and knowing that I can't impact and make the change that I can. And then beyond that, it's not really within my control. But I think there's more responsibility that yoga teachers have to take on, and knowing what yoga actually is. And it's not just an exercise.
Absolutely. And I want to, if it's okay, I want to add in like some complexity here, right? Because when it's someone who's from, the normative, like embodying a body of, or positionality of privilege. So in the West, that would be white folks. It's very different to me than when, say, a Black person says the same thing. And I do think that white folks have more responsibility to look at their positionality and their privilege, and to examine where they might be appropriating or taking up space or doing something to a wisdom tradition that doesn't come from their culture, and really consider not doing that, right? Like making that change. And then when it's folks of color, and in particular Black folks, I think it becomes more complex. And that's one of the details that we often don't sort out because it is messy. It's complex in part because, at least in the United States, Black folks were unseated from their sense of like place, time, sovereignty, language, culture. And so as a South Asian person, I don't really think it's my place to be like, I'm going to unseat you from your place of sovereignty within yoga, right? And so there's complexity there also because of positionality and power, and same with Indigenous folks. And so there's differences of opinion on this. I think there's some South Asians who feel really strongly like no matter what background, no matter where you come from, like you shouldn't be doing, yoga and whatever. Like, and then there's folks who more take a perspective, I think, like mine, that's like, there's nuance. So let's sit, let's address it, let's talk about it. And what I've found is when I'm able to just sit and like hold that tension with someone, that they're not necessarily going to change what they do, but they're more likely to include in conversations around respecting culture and cultural appropriation, and caring for the Indian roots, or just the, South Asian roots of yoga. And so that's been really heartening, I think, is to sit in that complexity. And I think that's just an ongoing choice that particularly as South Asians, right? It's like, we have to also like acknowledge, like, yes, this practice has been taken and oppressed and colonized, but also it's been used to colonize, and it's been used to oppress. And it still is even today. And so we also have to address those things as we're not, I guess, to simplify it, we're not only the victim, like we also can be, and yoga can be used in a position of oppression too.
Yeah, I've talked about this in my book and with other folks I've interviewed, where no matter the identity that we hold, we've all been brought up in these systems of oppression. And whether we know it or not, conscious or unconscious, we've internalized a lot of these things, internalized colonizer, internalized ways of being, of harm. And so I think yoga provides this pathway of inquiry to start to recognize and see in ways that we harm ourselves, harm others, no matter our identity. And I think it's also on us as like yoga teachers to also see where we have the possibility of causing harm. And it's not just like, well, I am of South Asian descent, so that means like I can do whatever I want with this practice. No, it just means that maybe I come from a place of deeper understanding, and maybe I also feel more angry, and that allows for me to speak out on these things, but doesn't mean I just speak out in a way to cause harm either. And so I think there are definitely nuances here, but also where yoga provides that pathway for deeper inquiry to sit with our own places of where we hold privilege, where we can cause harm. And I think that is a place of deeper reflection as well, if we are thinking about Black folks and Indigenous folks, and maybe not really focusing these conversations towards them, and instead towards folks that hold these positions of power, and having them really deeply understand. And I can agree with that point for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think actually what in the work that I've done, I've seen a lot of folks of color who aren't South Asian be like, but I want to be learning, and I want to be held more accountable. I just don't know how to not harm, And so I will also feel like, just again, this is my experience, right, from the people I work with. So it's a limited like set or demographic set, but that there is a lot of desire to actually learn and be more honoring, particularly from folks of color. And I would love if that were true for the kind of normative white. I try not to say dominant anymore, because we actually are the majority, right? But the normative Western white yoga space, like I wish there was more desire like that. And it is really hard. And I also want to acknowledge, I don't know if this, like anytime we're talking about these conversations, I think it can be so heartbreaking for folks. It can be so like the sadness and the grief of what we've lost, and what the potential for connecting to ourselves and our own ancestries and like that's been taken is so sad. It's like, it's beyond, it's not sad's not the right word. It's like tragic. And so, and angering, right? Like there's a lot of folks who are very, very angry. And so just normalizing that and holding space for that. And that's the other piece when someone's like, oh, I do yoga and X, and I'm just going to do it. It's like, well, okay. And then I invite you to hold space for our anger and our grief and our horror at what you're doing to like what we know, because that's a choice. And if you're going to choose to do that, we also get the space to express how we feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that reflection, because it does speak to there's consequences to actions. And if that's the action that you're going to choose, then other folks also have their right to respond in a way that's honoring for them as well, because we don't exist in a vacuum. Like it's not just me doing whatever I want. That's not going to affect someone else. And that's the reality of the world that we live in. And what I find yoga helps us to understand how to be in better relationship. And I think that's a really key point that you're making there as well. Something that I have found interesting the last couple of years is all of the private clients that have reached out to me have been folks of color, BIPOC. And the majority of them are like, I want to do a better job in honoring yoga, learning more about it. I've been practicing asana for years, and all of a sudden I realized, wait, there's more. And it's interesting to note that there have been no white folks. And I mean, I also know in the way that I teach and who I want to focus on, and maybe it's my languaging and the way that I present myself. But that is very interesting to note in that as well. And I also think about dismantling cultural appropriation workshops that I led, and majority white folks in that space, and the discomfort that I felt, and like having to be like, this is my pain, this is the harm I see. Can you see it? Do you understand it? And oftentimes by the time we got to the end of it, I could very clearly see for some of them, it had just went right over their head. And I was just like, and after a point, I've just started laughing. Like, I'm like, at this point, I'm just like, it's just going to be a humorous thing to me, because I can't, being angry all the time.
Yeah.
That just can't work either. Although I think the anger is good though. And I have experienced having folks be like, oh, you're too angry about that. Like, just be peaceful or calm. And it's like, we have a right to our anger. Like, let's not also censor folks for having their reactions to these very real things that can cause harm. So just bringing light to all of those things. The next question that I had for you, and this is very much in line with what we've been talking about, how does capitalism and commercialism show up in yoga? And how have people over the years appropriated it to turn it into a product that we can just sell and use and exploit?
I think about how, and again, I'm speaking from a context in the US because that's what I know and where I live and am situated now. When yoga came over, in whatever it was, 1896 or 7, and it was taught, it was a little bit on the East Coast, right, the Parliament of World Religions, but then Paramsa Yogananda moved over to the West Coast and taught, actually not far from where we are, in Hollywood and Santa Monica, that area. And I do think that's had a lot to do with the way that yoga took off in the West, in connection with capitalism and commercialism, because it was a lot of folks in the movie industry, and then also models, actors, actresses, who were initially kind of part of that whole set, very like image conscious, very body conscious, very, and by conscious, I mean just like self-conscious about, right? And so all of those things were like this perfect storm of these wisdom teachings connecting here, but those people had the money and they had the resources, and they also were more like liberal thinking enough to be able to learn from a brown man who at that time wasn't even allowed to emigrate into the country, right? Like, because of laws on the books, like, that at during a time when Jim Crow was in place, so where you would have had to drink at like the colored drinking fountains and use the colored restrooms, and so there's a lot that went into that first merging of capitalism and yoga, as well as in India under the British. Yogis were demoted, like kind of put down in status, like where for thousands of years, or at least, I think it was probably from around like somewhere around 500, maybe earlier BCE, to when the British came, there was a relationship between renunciate or sadhu or sannyasin practitioners, yogic practitioners, who wouldn't have all called themselves yogis, right? They may have had different names, but there was a relationship between them and their communities. And their communities understood that their practice, even if it was one of personal liberation, was going to benefit the community. And many of them would teach, right? So they would come and teach in the community. And so there was no money exchanged. It was like, here, we'll bring you breakfast and lunch. Often they would skip dinner, give you a place if you want a place, if they weren't like a wandering ascetic. But there was relational exchange. And that respect went down, in part because of Christianity, right? And the dominant religion thinking that it was superior and that anything else was inferior, in part because early on, before the British Raj, but just when the British East India Company, because the first folks may not know, but it was like economic control first of India by the British. During that time, there were many yogis in central India and Bihar region who basically like said, we're going to throw wrenches in the mechanics of the empire and stop the trade routes, stop the exploitation. And so because of that, there became across the British, the business owners, but then later also the political leaders, this thing of like, watch out for the yogis. They have powers, right? They have powers and they're interrupting and they're disrupting what we're doing. And so there became this like designation that a yoga practitioner, a sadhu was low, was like an untouchable, which again is like a very problematic designation of someone outside the caste system or who is at the lowest part of the caste system. And that went into both the Indian imagination as well as the Western imagination that a yoga practitioner was not of value and not to be energetically exchanged with. And so all of that context is how, when yoga came to the West, there was this like, it is, different. It is almost like a circus show, right? You can see some of the early iconography that we have from yoga practitioners in I think it was in Chicago and other places on the East Coast. They treated yoga practitioners like freaks, like freaks of nature, and to be exploited, right? Because when you dehumanize someone or something, it's easier to take advantage of it. So that is all the context for capitalism and commercialism. I went way back because I think it's no surprise that now, the biggest earners in yoga by far are the yoga clothing and props and mats, those companies. They are not owned by Indian folks, South Asian folks. And they make billions and billions of dollars on a practice that is not theirs. So it shows up there. And then, it's tricky because like with folks like you or me, right? Like if I teach a private yoga session, I'm going to charge for it. If I teach a teacher training or a workshop, I'm going to charge for it. But I just want to kind of emphasize, like, we're not the issue, right? Like we're working within the structure that we're in, which is late stage capitalism. And so we're having some form of exchange for our work. And how could we do it any differently? Like when people say, oh, it's yoga, shouldn't it be free? Like, but how am I going to feed my family, or pay my rent or whatever it is? So it's kind of like with pollution, like it's the big corporations, the governments, the military, right? Like, yes, we can do better. And I think we can talk about this if you want, but like there's many ways as individual teachers, we can do a more fair, more equitable kind of structure for how we charge or how we work with that. But I don't think that we are the problem. I think we're not the main problem. Really, it's the structure of capitalism. And if we change that structure, then I'd be more than happy to go back to trading. I think that would be wonderful, actually, to do it that way. So it shows up, though, for people like you and I or other teachers, in that we sometimes might feel we have to exploit the practice or exploit even ourselves to try to grind harder, to make more, to get more students or whatever. And that can be really detrimental to the practice and to people too. So there's so many ways.
Yeah, thank you so much for going into that history, because that provides a depth of understanding that I think otherwise we don't know and isn't commonly like taught, not even taught in like yoga teacher trainings. And so, yeah, thank you so much for going into that detail. I think the other thing that kind of comes up to me when we're talking about this like capitalism and commercialization in yoga, I think for us as teachers is also kind of that question of like, what is enough? Because I feel like that rampant capitalism also shows up in us also feeling like, for anyone feeling like we need more. And I think yoga to me helps me understand, well, what is enough? Where's the contentment? It's like, enough. This is perfect right now. And maybe if I do want more, okay, but even finding that more with the sense of like, okay, gratitude for what I have now. And in that more, not in like a grasping way. So I think there are things that we can also consider as teachers while also understanding who are the folks that are making most of the money within yoga. And it is those owners of the yoga mats and yoga clothes who have made yoga pants a thing. And can we keep our eye on the ball and not get distracted in who we maybe point our fingers at?
Yeah. Yeah. And then also like, wouldn't we want, like, this is the other thing I think about is like, how amazing would it be if so many South Asian folks of color who wanted to have careers in yoga and wellness could have that? Like, to me, that seems like reparations. That seems like part of what we're doing when we're trying to be in more right relationship is support those folks. And that support could look so many ways, including economic, right? But also, time, whatever, like that for me is a big part of kind of righting the imbalance. It's like representation isn't enough. And we certainly don't want just folks of color, like, brown faces in white places or taking up space in those ways. But I don't think that's what is happening. It's more like we've literally been erased from the site of our indigenous knowledge and cultural wisdom. And because we've been erased, it's so hard for us to take up space there. And not only that, it's like the way these cultures of power work is they have to erase us because we threaten them, even though like we're not actually necessarily, we're not like trying to now completely kick you out, but it's like I can't, there's so many yoga teachers that I write to, or even companies that I write to say, hey, would you be willing to talk about cultural appropriation? And many of them say yes, but some of them just ignore me or say no. And I have to think, well, it's because they feel, again, like we're a threat. But it's not so simple as just person to person where we're like equal and putting the hands together one next to the other. It's like they have all this immense power and positionality. And like, how did they get to be, I don't know, whatever, like multi-million people yoga follower in the first place is because of privilege. And so that their responsibility, I think, is to then lift others up. And I'll take myself as an example because I don't want to name other names, but I'm light-skinned, I'm mixed, right? Like I'm caste privileged. I have so much privilege. And I happen to have built a significant following. And I had this thought the other day. I was like, why am I one of the only Indian yoga teachers in the West that has a lot of followers? Like there's so many white teachers. And it also took me like 6 years of consistent work. Like that, I did not I just kept going. It's kind of ridiculous. The wall, but it's not right. Like there needs to be more representation, and at the same time, representation is not enough. But it really should be like all of us who want this should be like up front, center, foregrounded. All the big organizations, all the clothing companies, right, should be like taking our ideas and partnering with us. And it's not that yet. I think it will be. I think in the next decade, it's going to change. But, that's going to be up to your readers and the people that we work with, right? Like, and support and learn from too, to help make that change.
You hear that, listeners and readers? This is not you got this. I think that's such a, good point that you brought up as well, is like, if we say we look out into Instagram, there's so many white teachers that have hundreds of thousands of followers, millions of followers. And then when I do think about South Asian folks, or even also Black folks within yoga and their following, it's just not the same. And I think that's such a good example that you're giving with yourself of this like continuous, so much work went into it to get to this point 6 years later.
Yeah. And then the other thing, and you do this, it's so many of us, like, this is the other thing. Okay. Harpinder, really, it's like, it makes me so mad because, okay, the minute we get that positionality, so many people are like, but why her, right? They're willing to take us down, folks from within our communities. And we're also the ones lifting, like, I don't see a lot of those white teachers lifting up I don't see a lot of people, like, from the beginning, they don't like the other folks have always been lifting up other folks too. But it's like, we can't just be there. We have to be, I don't know, like representing something bigger than us. And we are, but also white folks don't get held to that same standard. We have so much, it's easier for us to fail. And when we fail, it's also so much harder for us to recover from that. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of white supremacy and how it shows up in yoga is we just don't have the same, we don't have the same starting point. And then if things go awry, which, I mean, we're human. Like, I'm sure all of us have said or done things that we look back at and we're like, ooh, that could have done that differently. But it's challenging to recover, more challenging for folks of color to recover from. And so I don't know, I'm curious how you think that can change, right? Because representation isn't enough, and yet we are so underrepresented. And when we do get representation, it comes with so much scrutiny and critique. Like, how do we change that? Because I'm thinking of your readers or the listeners, right? Like why would they want to step into that? And I would say definitely do if you have the desire, because it's okay. Like, you'll have lots of people who love you and support you. But also, like, that is part of it because of systems for power.
Yeah. And I think I think there's a lot of different layers that go into that, where I feel like there's the tokenism, there's the competitiveness that comes within folks. There's a scarcity that comes in, where I feel like white supremacy has kind of made it so we think and we ingrain this belief in ourselves where, like, well, only one of us from our community can have that seat at the table. So if that person gets it, then I can't get it. And I know in my work, I've had to do a lot of like deconditioning, deprogramming, and the Women of Color Summit was a big project for me in that, where it's like uplifting and supporting all of us so we all grow and come up together. Otherwise, I feel like that programming of the scarcity and only one of us can succeed, and the scrutiny that we place on ourselves and those that look like us seems to be, I feel like, that default programming, and we need to question it. Like, I feel like we need to question in ways that also harms ourselves. Because I think about when we are scrutinizing someone, placing that scrutiny on someone that looks like us, why do they have that? Whatever it is. To me, that just says, what level of perfectionism are we placing on ourselves? Where we're all imperfect. We're all imperfect, trying to do the best that we can. And what are we focusing our attention on? And I think that shows up in different ways, where I definitely have seen in the space of the competitiveness with one another. In Australia, it's known as like a tall poppy seed or tall poppy syndrome, where if you see someone like rising up, you want to kind of cut them down. So everyone is kind of at the same level. And it's just like, well, if that person is rising, and I that reminds me of Karuna or Mudita, where if you see someone that's virtuous, is that you have joy for them. Like, look at them go, is you have that, like, wow, I support them. Like, they're helping all of us. And I think that's an inherent part of yoga practice. So why aren't we practicing that when we see someone doing something that's like, wow, look at them helping the community? And I think that's a good point that you're bringing up, and a cause for reflection for everybody in ways that shows up for ourselves. And I think the other thing that makes me think about is how deeply ingrained some of these things are within us, and the importance of practicing and slowing down. Otherwise, we stay within that default programming and we keep operating in that way. And so I'm so grateful that you shed light to these things, but also the way that you do uplift other teachers and you continue to kind of like pioneer in this space. Because I'm positive it can't be easy. Definitely cannot be easy.
Yeah, I've had to learn and grow a lot, especially because I like people to like me. That's just not always going to be the case. And so it's really taught me a lot. And I think the biggest like thing that I turn to right now is like, it's a reflection, like where people are at is a reflection of them, like you're saying, more than of me. And I am very open for transparent and kind of like, accountability and relationships, but I'm going to also go where I am wanted and focus on those relationships and, let the ones that are more critical without that relationship of transparent communication, but just critical, not pay as much attention to that, because the work is, I feel like, I truly believe yoga is it's the path to potentially creating world peace. Like I wouldn't do what I do if I didn't. And for me, it's like, and I believe that because it's created world peace in this world. Like I was not a peaceful, happy person for most of my young adult life and my childhood, some of it. And the only thing that changed that was this practice. And so if it can do that, I absolutely think it can do that in, communities, in conversations, in boardrooms, in hospitals, in educational settings, like everywhere, and so I don't have time to waste if someone doesn't like me or the way that I'm doing something and isn't ready to have a conversation. Like I'm open to the conversations, absolutely, and to listening and to, taking care if I've caused harm. But if it's just critique for the sake of critique, like let's just keep focused and moving forward. And that has made a big difference. That's really helped, because for a long time, I really dwelled on the critique and like, oh, is there something in there that I need to listen to? And I still do. I'll listen to it and I'll take the lesson like, oh, okay, I could have done that better. Or I could have, even if it's not said kindly. And then I'll just keep going. And that does help, because there's so many people who value what we have to do and what we have to share. And they may not always tell us, but the critics, it's like show up very loudly and mirror the inner critic. So it's a whole thing, but it's another place to bring the practice of like focusing and then choosing what I'll focus on and then moving in the continual direction of growth.
And I think this is an important lesson for yoga students, yoga teachers, but also just humans in general. Because like we've been talking about, is we're all in relationship with one another. And some of that relationship or energy in the world that we live in now, we're just plugged into so much. We're just plugged into like thousands and millions of people, where before it would have been like my community of 50 people. And I had a session with my therapist yesterday where we spoke, and we're getting really off topic, but I think this is important in this space, because yoga is about really uncovering these deeper depths within ourselves. And with my therapist, we kind of took a look at the part of me that in writing this book comes out and says, you don't know enough. This book's going to be bad. Everyone's going to hate it. Then people are really going to know how much you don't know. You're a bad writer. And we investigated that part of myself, and that part of myself was kind of like hunched over, just covered in slime. and was really tuned in to like the energy of all the critics and the internet trolls and just this negative energy. And in this like work going over to that part of myself, this like orb of energy around it to kind of protect that part of myself. And the slime came off and emerged a 12-year-old version of me. And I think it can be, and I work with a lot of teens now at mental health centers. And I think there is just the reality of so much negativity and the comparison and the critiques that are alive right now in the modern world that we live in, just being so connected to millions of people. Just, I grab my phone, boom, I'm there. So I think for us as then modern yoga practitioners is holding that as a reality. And what can we then do within our practice to, in a way, kind of shield and protect ourselves from that? Because that pulls our focus away. That pulls away that like one pointed concentration on our mind, on our focus, on our goal, on that liberation. If we're constantly like, what about that person? What about that person? But they're going to say that. And I say that myself as a person who loves compliments and loves external validation. And my yoga teacher had to work with me to be like, that's great that your student said that thing about you. And that's great that that student loved that thing about you. But you need to build that validation for yourself, because at the end of the day, that's what counts. And I'm still working on that. It's not there yet. But I think this is an important conversation.
I love that practice you just shared that you went through with your therapist. That was helpful for me personally, because I also have those feelings, and it just felt very normalizing. So I hope you include that in some form or fashion in the book, because that was really, that like helped my soul. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm glad that helped. Yeah, because I think the part of this practice too is normalizing all of these things, and how so many of us feel lesser than, not enough, no matter what our status is. I think that's important. Another question that I had for you as we start to move towards the end of our conversation is, how can people begin their work of either decolonizing, dismantling themselves, these internalized beliefs that they might have, and then their understanding and study and practice of yoga in its sort of holistic, more encompassing way?
Yeah. I mean, decolonization, I feel like, kind of like colonization, it's not just a one-time thing, right? It's a process. So it's something that we'll probably be in and committed to. I mean, I feel like I'll be committed to it my whole life. And so one thing is to like know that you're entering a process that's going to change you, and that it maybe will change like some of the choices that you make and the things that you do in your life, and that it will take time. And so unpacking the need to do it right, to be perfect at it, to allow yourself not to rush, but to go slowly in order to stay consistent. Because one of the things I've seen a lot is like people rush in and they buy all the books, and then they want to do all the book clubs and all the work. And then they're like, I can't tell you how many people were like, Susanna, your book, I read like a quarter of it, and then I got overwhelmed and I had to stop. And I was like, oh. And then I thought, like, I started to feel like, I had to put qualifiers around it. Like, no, actually, you just need to slow down with it and come back to it. And I'm imagining that yours will be the same, of like this isn't something to just be consumed in a weekend, right? This is like a book to pick up, to come back to think through, to like let a question that you ask simmer and percolate, and, maybe like practice with, like, so there's a way that we need to, I feel like part of decolonizing is to engage differently, like to kind of pattern interrupt our usual ways of engagement. General decolonization work is going to mean getting into relationship with the indigenous practitioners of a practice that you're connecting with, as well as the indigenous stewards of the land that you're on, right? So that also can take time, and it's a process and takes building relationship. I can't think of what's more valuable though than like building meaningful relationships. Like that gives so much meaning to life. And so doing that with folks who steward the land or the practices that we're practicing is a big way that I think I and we can decolonize. And then, like you've said throughout our time talking, is like yoga is a practice that teaches us to go inward, that teaches us to self-reflect and to practice svadhyaya. In terms of yoga, to explore and learn, practice and teach as much of the full expanse of what yoga is as possible, and to not jump too quickly from practicing to teaching. So like, for example, with mantra, like my teacher, so I don't teach mantra, I chant mantra because it's part of my practice and I've been practicing with it for a couple decades. But if I was to teach, I'd probably go do 20 more years of study before I taught. And so I hope that like lands for folks is like really take time with things before you go and turn to teach. Like you don't have to learn something and then turn around and teach it right away. And so explore and practice all of the limbs of yoga, and then cite references, like refer to your book, right? Put it on the bookshelves, put it on the teacher training list, write to your local libraries, like get the works of folks of color, particularly South Asian folks in yoga, out there and continue to do that. And then I think for those ready for a bit more of a, like, I don't know, like challenge in a way, it's like ask ourselves and other yoga practitioners, teachers, studios, yoga spaces, institutions, the challenging questions, like ask, like, why are there not, say, South Asian yoga teachers on your teacher training faculty? Why is there, like, why do I not see books by, South Asian folks on the reading list? Why is this festival like mostly white folks, right? Like these are questions we can start to ask with curiosity, not in opposition, but in order to help create and change the culture. And it might be asking ourselves those hard questions of like, wow, I'm just putting myself like if I think about when I lived in Orlando, it was a small yoga community, and I would say 90% white, and it was also still hard for those teachers to make a living. So it's like, wow, if I like split this workshop or bring in a South Asian yoga teacher, I'm going to be making half the profit. So how do I sustain and also do more of what's right? How can this be not at detriment to me, or maybe at detriment to me, but maybe that's okay because of the history of erasure and, extraction and all of that. So it's really asking those hard questions. Yeah, I think those are some of the ways I can think about with decolonizing. Just trying to think. Oh, I think the last thing I would probably say, there's so much. There's much, much more. It's like, I'm sure your whole book is this goes into this, but is connecting to natural rhythms, right? Mm-hmm. Because yoga as an original earth-based practice was connecting us to nature, to earth, wind, fire, air, space, to the elements within us and all around us. And even, Brahminical patriarchal yoga cut us off from that. So it's not like the West was the only one to appropriate. Like there's been histories of appropriation, and we can go back to those natural connections. We don't have to stay disconnected. And that is so liberating. That's part of what yoga gives us. And it definitely is part of decolonizing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of those different ways that folks can begin this process of decolonization. And I think it's important also as another reminder of go slow. There's not a race. It's not a race who can be like the best person at this. Because otherwise maybe you will burn out, or you'll give up, or you go back to your default programming. And I just love all the other examples that you gave as well, and really tuning into the natural rhythms of the world around us as we become kind of more and more like on laptops and computers and inside. Like, how do we go outside and connect back to the land and to the beings? And it's important. This morning, I was just like looking outside. It was raining today in Los Angeles. I'm not sure if it is where you are. Is it?
It is. It's so rainy.
Yeah, it's really nice. I was looking outside, and I love the rain, and just watching my cat in the rain. She doesn't seem to mind it, which I think is really funny and kind of unusual for a cat. And she was just like staring into some dirt and just watching bugs, walking by. And I was like, if I could have that level of concentration on just like a bug, like that to me would really be yoga, just being so focused on living in the present moment and not just like, I have this thing to do and then now that thing, and the speed and the urgency. And so moving slowly on this path, I think, is such a beautiful reminder. So thank you for sharing with us, Susanna. As we kind of close, is there anything else that you wish to share? Any hopes that you have for modern yoga or for practitioners?
I mean, I do really hope that this practice, the fullness of it, is preserved for the future. And when I started this work, I wasn't sure that it was going to be. I do now think that it will be. And I would say it's because there's so many more of us doing this work. And I feel like if you know, for folks listening or reading, it's like, if you have, like, if there's anything in you that's like, oh, I want to go deeper in this practice. Oh, there's something calling to me about yoga. Oh, what if I could teach? What if I could take up space in that world? And you're a person of color, you're a South Asian, like, please do it. Like, yes, we want you, we need you. And no pressure, right? Like, you don't have to, but also if you're feeling it, like, we are cheering you on, and our ancestors are cheering you on. And it's you and I, all of us, that are going to make that difference for the future of yoga. And for our allies, also, it's like, every time you care about the heart of yoga, every time you learn about something beyond asana, and you teach in a way, I'm going to pause. Can you hear my puppy?
I could hear him barking.
You can? Yeah.
I did hear him, but I think adds a little flavor to the.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Like, every time you teach in a way that brings in the leadership of South Asian folks, or of like expanded yoga culture, you're helping preserve this tradition too. And you're also connecting back to your own roots, your own connection to the earth, to the land, to nature. So we need all of us. And I would say just keep going, like, keep practicing, keep teaching. And then also, let's like change the language, because you can't really go to yoga, but you can be yoga. So let's be like not I'm going to yoga class, right? But I don't know how would we say it? Like, I'm gonna be yoga in community for a little while.
Gosh, Sham Ranganathan talks about like the big Y yoga and the small Y yoga, and the big Y yoga being that essence, and the small Y yoga being the practices. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting way to look at it. And I was like, it makes sense to have that like designation. So we're not all just like thinking small Y yoga is all that there is. And it's like, the practices are to get us to that essence of feeling, into that big Y yoga. And hopefully, so that becomes more of our time alive, we feel in that way. And I think that's to me, I was like, oh, interesting. I've never heard it that way. So that was helpful.
It's really beautiful. I love that. And I just want to say I'm so excited for your book and your work. And yeah, I'm really, really I'm very excited for your book in particular, Harpinder, and for the, having seen the work that you do and the way that you are writing and thinking and talking, and your guidance for us and for this practice it's like immeasurably helpful. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Susanna. Because I definitely feel that sense of like the critic and the fear and all those things, and to know that there are folks like yourself that are like cheering on and supporting, and also doing the work is just so amazing and so incredible. And so I so appreciate you, Susanna, agreeing to be on this podcast and being so supportive and sharing your wisdom, and in this way helping to uplift so many of us. And also for me is also this other reminder to keep going, to keep uplifting others and building these like strong, beautiful communities. So thank you so much. I'm just like so appreciative. And I'm going to link all this stuff in the show notes and other things as well. But where can people find you?
Yes. So I do a lot of like fun education on Instagram. So you can follow me at my name at Susanna Barkataki. And I also run an institute called Ignite Institute for Yogic Leadership and Social Change. And we run teacher trainings, but we're soon to be moving into running like Train the Trainer. And for folks who want to run their own teacher trainings that are culturally connected and social justice informed in their communities. And then also like DEI, mindfulness, DEI, speaking, teaching, all of that. So because to me, this is that exact thing of like, it's no longer, it's not going to be any one of us, it's going to be all of us. And so how do we get the work out there so other people can go out and share and teach? And so if you're interested in that, probably the best place to go is also my name, my website. So SusannaBarkataki.com.
Awesome. And I will have all those things linked so everyone can find it. Thank you, Susanna, so much. This was a wonderful conversation. And I know I learned so much. I know folks that will be listening to this will learn so much. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, so much for tuning in, for listening. I'll see y'all for the next one. Bye.
Thank you for being a part of this journey. If you resonated with this episode, please share it with your community and let's keep this conversation going. You can connect with me on Instagram at Harpinder Man Yoga and dive deeper with my book, Liberating Yoga from Appropriation to Healing. Until then, keep practicing with intention and integrity. This is Liberating Yoga, where we honor yoga's past and shape its future. Bye, y'all.